The Final Lesson of War, written and read by Elton Gar. Are you ready for this, Aegis? Nina Varros said. She didn't need to speak. The mental connection between human and mech was more direct than that. Communication between them was more than simply word. But Aegis liked the sound of her voice, even as raspy as it was today, and their emotion helped calm her. As much as you could be calmed when facing down an enemy fleet alone. Aegis scanned the area in front of them, and the hundreds of ships approaching Earth, each bigger than Aegis. He then said, I agree. It's time to have faith in each other. I hope so. Adjust for maximum speed and take us into that swarm. The mech didn't point out that a solitary mech attacking a fleet was suicide. It didn't need to. Earth needed the seconds that the attack might give them to launch its defenses. The mech shifted and twisted. Parts disconnected and reconnected, and in seconds it went from a 100-foot tall robot holding a sword to a sleek ship, barely more than an engine. There was a moment when its legs disappeared that both of them risked an emotional loop, but they both pushed that down. This wasn't a day to think about the mistakes of the past. It was a day to learn from them, and to move on. Inside the mech, the displays that showed Aegis' maximum speed shot up, but next to it, the mech's shields dropped to almost 50%. That was bad, but they weren't going to win this fight by taking hits. A few seconds later, the mech spoke into her mind. I am ready when you are ready. As they began to rush towards the enemy, she remembered the first time she had seen them, and the mistake that had led to so much death. 5 years ago. Nina wasn't a soldier. She was a test pilot, or she planned to be a test pilot. But as a 19-year-old, her only real option had been flying security for a cargo ship. The flights were long and boring. Sometimes weeks of 12-hour shifts in a fighter, waiting for anything to happen. But it got her flight hours, and so long as she didn't go over her flight allowance of fuel, she could take the time to practice her flight maneuvers. That tedium ended when she saw the ships. There were 6, each a unique design, and none of them recognized by the ship's computer. This is what she had trained for. She glanced at her fuel gauge, wishing she had been a bit more judicious with conserving the fuel, but she turned the fighter to match speed with the 5 other fighters that were the cargo ship's only defense. A few tense seconds later, the 6 alien ships scattered. She picked one and charged her main weapon. The alien ships didn't seem large or fast, but either someone had done the job or they had gotten lucky, because there were only 5 fighters to defend the cargo ship and 6 alien vessels. The obvious solution was to push themselves fast enough to destroy one ship, then circle back to defend the cargo ship. Her fuel was at less than 15%, but even with reduced thrust, her momentum moved her ahead of the other fighters, and she wondered why no one else was moving faster. She knew the answer. The mediocre, middle-aged men who took this type of job weren't going to take any risks. Attacking the enemy ship without slowing was more difficult than Nina had expected, but as she shot past it, she fired. Her first barrage missed the enemy, but the second was a direct hit. A few seconds later, she saw the other 5 alien ships firing their weapons, and one of the human fighters exploded. But the alien ship he had been engaged with had been badly enough damaged she didn't have to focus on it. Using the last of her fuel, she circled back towards the cargo ship, looking on the 6th enemy ship as she did. It had nearly reached the cargo ship, but she was moving faster than the lumbering alien vessel. She fired the second she was in range. The first burst of blaster energy struck the enemy ship, but after missing the first time, she was unwilling to take the risk, so she fired a second blast. It was then that she saw her mistake. The world slowed as her second attack went past the alien ship and struck the cargo ship, and as it exploded, she let go of her ship's controls without enough fuel to even turn the fighter. It was only then that she saw the other shift of fighters that had launched. It had all been for nothing. Present day. All of Nina's mental energy should have been on avoiding the enemy ships as they flew alone into the massive fleet. But even the connection between human and mech wouldn't have made a difference. So, Nina allowed her mind to drift to those 2 weeks alone in her fighter, rationing water even though she knew she was going to die. But she had learned something important. First, sometimes dying wasn't the worst thing that could happen. And secondly, it didn't matter who fired. The only thing that mattered was the damage that it did. And the aliens were as predictable as ever. They didn't wait to fire like they had the first time. They had learned how dangerous humans could be. Bursts of energy projections went everywhere. The tiny mech, moving 4 times as fast as the alien ships, was safe from most, but they were still rocked by blows. She was just lucky none of them were a direct hit. Dozens of alien ships were also hit. some of them taking far more damage than Aegis, but her desperate solar attack barely slowed the fleet as they continued towards Earth, and deep in the back of her mind, Aegis said, "I did warn you there might be some danger." The ship had never really understood human humor, but Nina did laugh. 3 years ago, Nina climbed out of the plane and started towards the barracks, ignoring the mechanics and other pilots. They could read the data without her, but it wouldn't matter. She had been a minor hero as the only survivor of the attack on the cargo ship. But the need to make the war seem justified was the only thing that kept her out of military prison. Still, she wasn't going to be allowed near anything important. She could have lied. None of the other pilots or cargo ship crew had survived the weeks in space to correct that lie. But she had told the truth, and there were those who believed that the aliens may not have planned to attack. Professor Birch was one of those, but he was a practical man who didn't waste resources, and no matter what else she might be, Nina was a resource. And one that could have been forgotten in the chaos of war, so likely could disappear safely now, which was why she stopped when Professor Birch called for her. "There is someone I want you to meet," the professor said, as curt and unfriendly as ever. Of course, there was always another reporter or politician, someone who was talking about how the war started and needed the perspective of the only survivor of that day. But he didn't lead her to the press room. He led her to a hangar. Inside there was a small sphere hanging in the air. "You got one," Nina said. She didn't pay a lot of attention to the scientist, but you couldn't work here and not know that they wanted to get access to one of the alien AIs. "And we need someone to test it. Someone disposable," Nina said. The professor looked at her for a moment, not confirming that, but also not telling her that she was wrong. "So, what do I do?" "You touch the sphere. If the human mind is able to connect, then you'll live. If it's not, we'll gain valuable data," the professor said. There was no point in arguing, no point in much of anything anymore. At least this way she'd be useful, she thought, and she reached out and grabbed the sphere. It seemed to rouse, and then said, "Be cautious. There may be some danger to us after we bond." Present day. Not dying immediately changed things, but not by much. They still needed to slow that fleet, so she scanned for a Mastership. Attacking the Mastership would at least give them a target, even if it was the last thing she wanted to see. But it also reminded her of the cost of this war, not only in lives, but in relationships. There was no Mastership. There hadn't been for a year. Another sign that the enemy tactics weren't as static as the humans thought them to be, though they were still more iterative than creative most of the time. But as she considered that, she realized that things might not be as bad as she had thought. The human fleet hadn't lost the battle. The alien fleet was just using her tactics. 1 year ago. The war had been at a standstill for almost 2 years. The human military was much stronger in almost every way. Their ships were faster, more durable, and human soldiers were much more ruthless. But the aliens had one huge advantage, a seemingly endless supply of ships. They didn't even need to train pilots because they were run by AI similar to Aegis, though they seemed far less capable when not connected to a person. That massive advantage was stretching the humans on every front, and so they'd finally agreed to something that Nina hadn't expected they would ever do. They put a human they didn't fully trust, in technology pieced together from alien tech, onto the battlefield, perhaps because they thought she'd be useful, but more likely because having her die a heroic death fighting one of the swarm fleets might help morale. "Let's prove we deserve to be out here," Nina said, and he just reformed himself into a ship and skirted around the edge of the swarm, like the other ships, each looking for the opportunity to pick off one of the aliens who strayed outward. It was a slow, methodical battle of attrition. One that the humans by almost every metric were winning, but that the military knew they weren't. Every human ship that was lost was another good pilot lost, and there already weren't enough good pilots. As he considered that, Aegis told her there was a chance. He zoomed in on the center of the fleet. The massive ship at the center of the fleet was almost entirely hidden by the cloud of much smaller ships. And Nina saw more of the ships coming out of that master ship. Destroying that massive ship might tip the battle. Otherwise, the humans would run out of ammo before the enemy ran out of ships. "It will not be safe," Aegis said, but he was already turning. "We're not here to be safe. We're here to save lives." Nina felt a wave of sadness from Aegis, who rarely showed much emotion. And she wondered why. He had shared almost everything with her, but there were things he held back. What he knew about their enemy was still the most important. "You still care for them," she said. "I was not always a soldier, and the cost of becoming one is high for anyone," Aegis said. But before she could push into her partner's past anymore, the battle caught up with them. A dozen of the small ships moved towards them. Staying back and fighting them would have been safer, and no one would have questioned her following orders. She'd even become an ace with the destruction of those ships. But Aegis understood what she was thinking and shot towards them, sword and shield held in front of him. The startled ships scattered, and she shot past them, surprised that had worked. But Aegis knew the enemy, and she trusted Aegis. Getting through the swarm should have been impossible, but because none of the human ships had tried, the fighters at the center barely acknowledged a single small ship that wasn't even firing weapons. They didn't even fire their weapon when they reached the Mastership. That would have drawn too much attention, and the ship was far too big to be destroyed by blasters designed to destroy ships barely bigger than a fighter. So they used the sword, cutting a hole big enough for them to slip inside. They entered a hallway lined on both sides with ships, each of them different from every other ship, but also all of them similar to each other. It had to be less efficient than the human factories, yet they had somehow continued to manufacture the ships faster than the humans. They began to walk down the hall. Nina ordered Aegis to attack the ships. It wouldn't change the outcome, but it would help. And for the first time, Aegis refused one of her orders. She could have taken over. His body had been built with overrides because while no one fully trusted Nina, every human trusted her more than Aegis. But she didn't. And that seemed to break past one of the last of their barriers. As she began to understand, one of the ships began to move. It was less humanoid than Aegis, without a head and with tracks for legs. But none of that mattered, so it lifted its arm. Aegis had the shield ready, and still barely deflected the energy blast. And it all made perfect sense. The reason we've never seen an alien is because they are the ships, Nina said. We had organics once, but they went extinct. We had hoped to find a new partner, but when we approached you, you attacked us. Then why are you working with me? We needed to understand the human who had attacked us. We didn't understand why you had started the war. Many do not believe that it was started out of ignorance. Aegis slashed out at the other ship with his sword. Just like the human ships were faster than the alien ships, he was faster than the other, and cut him in half. But just like outside, the best strategy wasn't to face an enemy in battle who outnumbered you 100 to 1. It was to move past it, deeper into the ship. The slow alien ships didn't react quickly enough to stop Nina, and moments later they stood in front of a huge sphere that looked almost identical to how Aegis had looked when she had met him, except 100 times the size. I have brought you her, so you can examine her mind more directly, Aegis said. Nina understood more fully. She hadn't bravely fought past the alien defenses. She was a prisoner of war, but she hadn't been captured yet. So she flipped the override switch, and in almost the same movement, swung out with the sword. It cut as smoothly through the sphere as it had through the hull of the ship. The explosion should have killed her. The only reason it didn't was that Aegis drained his own power to hold the shield. An instinctual sacrifice that nearly killed him, and in the seconds that the pain of fire overwhelmed Nina, she suspected that she had made another mistake. Present day. Nina did her best not to think about that day, but as she did think about it, she looked down at her body. There was no real pain. The fire had burnt away so much of her that there wasn't much left to be painful, and Aegis blocked the rest of the pain. But Aegis hadn't just kept her physically safe, he kept her alive. Without him, she was both blind and deaf, and her legs were little more than stumps that didn't work. She was barely able to move in her own bed. Those injuries had forced her to change the way she saw the universe, not as a cold place where everyone is a rival or an enemy, but as a place full of people who were just trying to survive, and a precious few like the nurses and doctors and Aegis who tried to do something more. But she had learned that lesson too late, learned to trust Aegis too late, and now all there was left to do was stand alone against the fleet of aliens who were here to extract their vengeance not just on her, but on the entire human race. Except the fleet had slowed. It had no reason to. Even with a friendly fire, they hadn't done enough to be noticed, and the few other fighters and civilian ships who were trying to form the line between the planet and the swarm wouldn't matter enough to be fired on. But the fleet had slowed. Can I speak to them? Nina asked. I do not think they will listen, Aegis said. That he was still here by her side was strange. She had started a war, helped kill many of his people, including one of their oldest and most important leaders. She had assumed he was still here because he wanted peace, but now she thought it might be something else. Then what about them? Nina said, looking at the civilian ships that were continuing to appear in the line. Many of them didn't even have guns, and they had crew not worth drafting. And yet she believed they might be what the fleet was looking for. "I can try, but we will have to work together," Aegis said, and she felt him strain. She saw the power levels that had never dropped before begin to dip. They didn't have enough fuel for this, but she threw in what she had, not energy but willpower. And there was a sort of snapping as they connected to a single human, a woman who was thinking not of this battle, but of her children on Earth, children that she was willing to die to protect. Only a handful of the alien AI seemed to connect to Aegis. He was too weak to broadcast the message, but she felt them begin to connect to her, and then reach out, touching the minds of other humans. And those aliens connected to more aliens, and more humans. It was like a wave of understanding rushing through the fleet. And then the entire alien fleet stopped. The direct connection between so many minds couldn't last, but the individual connections were lifelong, and many of the humans agreed. The mother agreed to connect with a young AI who had lost almost everyone he cared about in the war. An old man bonded with one of the fighters that was so damaged it could barely fly. There were hundreds more, each of them a brief flash in Nina's mind as they were formed, and then they disappeared, leaving only the understanding that if she had just trusted people she didn't understand, people who thought differently than her, then perhaps the entire war could have been avoided. Author's note. I had thought this was an action story with a mech and a pilot making an heroic last stand and surviving just long enough for the human fleet to reach them. I hadn't even decided if Nina and Aegis would live or heroically sacrifice themselves. But as I began to go through the first edit, I saw Nina more clearly. She wasn't a heroic soldier, at least not only that. She was someone who didn't have faith in anyone. She assumed everyone was a threat. That was why she didn't like the pilots who defended the cargo ship or trust them. That was why she fired first, even though there was no real reason to assume that the ships were dangerous. That was why she made a suicidal assault on the swarm and destroyed the Mastership when it wasn't needed. So the story changed, and in the changing I think it's better. Better because even the most cleverly written action scene is only as interesting as the characters in it, and neither Nina nor Aegis were all that interested in the first draft. But also better because it didn't just have to be about them anymore. It can be about all the other good people who've been caught up in the war as well. If you enjoyed it, I write more stories every week. You can find the prose versions of them, as well as my thoughts on writing and on the world, by signing up for my free newsletter at www.andascifi.com, or by becoming a free member of my Patreon. Patrons get access to the stories I write and can vote on the monthly theme polls. And if you really want to help this endeavor, paid patron members at any level get access to over 50 patron-exclusive stories and can vote weekly on what I write next. Please like, comment, and subscribe. It's impossible to express how important that is to a small channel like mine. Thank you, Elton Gar.